Hello and welcome back to Between the Hashes, our weekly college football primer, coming to you once again from Los Angeles, California, but unfortunately not at SoFi Stadium. I'm your host, Matt Keim, and there is only one game left to talk about this week. Tomorrow night, SoFi, number 1 Georgia versus number 3 TCU, a national championship game. So this game is actually fascinating for a number of reasons. Let's be honest, TCU probably shouldn't be here, and in most years, they wouldn't be. There's a lot of things with TCU that make them a complete and utter outlier for the sport, not just for this year, but kind of in just the recent memory of what college football has been. For starters, they have a blue chip ratio of in the low 20s. Now, quick aside, blue chip ratio means the amount of players on a given roster who were 4 or 5 star recruits coming out of high school. So teams like Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, etc., typically have a blue chip ratio of somewhere of 75% and up. And this year, feel free to fact check me out in the comments. I think Georgia was around 78% coming into the year. I'm using 247 on that one. That might be outdated information. But at any rate, only 4 teams ever have played for a national championship with a blue chip ratio of under 50%. TCU this year is one of those teams. They're also substantially lower than some of the other teams that are on that list. As of the time of this recording, the Vegas line on this game is 12.5 in favor of Georgia. And one of the unique things about this is that in the past 40 years, I'm going to cite a really well done article from Bill Connolly on ESPN here. Only 12 times in the past 40 years has there been a bowl game with a line of double digits or higher. Of those 12, only 3 upsets occurred, with the most recent one also happening in the national championship game, where Ohio State took down the defending champion Miami Hurricanes in the 2003 Fiesta Bowl. So in a lot of ways, TCU is the perfect Cinderella story here. They weren't even a Power 5 school until the early 2010s, at which point they joined the Big East briefly and then the Big 12 Conference. Quick history lesson, they were kind of a school that got left out when the Big 8 in the Southwest Conference started breaking up. Schools like them, SMU, Houston kind of got shafted to the side, whereas schools like Texas, Oklahoma State all kind of like banded together. Making this even more unlikely, the man who kind of guided TCU through most of this period and kind of really built them into the program they are today, Gary Patterson, was their coach for 20 years and was let go in kind of a messy breakup between the two sides right after the school built a statue for the man. In the previous 4 seasons leading up to this one, TCU is 1 game under 500. Only 5 players on their current roster have ever played in a bowl game, let alone one of this magnitude or of the Fiesta Bowl's magnitude. In fact, TCU was not even expected to be ranked this year. They weren't ranked in the preseason AP poll. They were picked to finish 7th in the Big 12 Conference. Nobody saw this coming. Their season was kind of miraculous in a lot of ways, and the fact that they have kept having to come back. They're the best second half team in the country in terms of offensive rating. Coming back against Kansas State the way they had to do, at least in that first game. Coming back against Oklahoma State, going into Texas, and then shutting them down on offense, and jumping out to the lead that they did in Michigan, which is what allowed them to win that game. No team has generally made it to this point with a defense as bad as theirs. They were, I think, 74th overall in total defense coming into that playoff game. That number has fallen to about 80th now. Just paint a picture of how unlikely this run is. TCU being here is kind of equivalent of like Butler being in the championship game in March Madness or something like that. We don't generally see equivalences to this. If TCU to win this, technically they already have like a national championship deep in like their history in the early AP poll days. But the last team to win a championship for the first time was Florida in 1996. It would be kind of like, this is generally not a sport that's built for parity, and it's generally not a sport that's built to support Cinderella runs. I've talked at length in this video series about Max Duggan, who came in second in Heisman voting and arguably could have won it had had they finished the job against Kansas State in the Big 12 title game. Between Duggan and Johnston, their receiver, you have a passing attack that can give Georgia fits. One thing that Georgia has been struggling with on defense, especially after losing a couple of key guys to injury in November, the long ball. And TCU is one of the best teams in the entire sport right now at scoring plays of 20, 40, and 50 yards, especially the latter. Something that greatly helped them out with Michigan, and it's something they're desperately going to need in this game. So how does TCU win this game? How can TCU win this game? I almost kind of think they need to replicate what they did against Michigan. I said going into the Michigan game that what TCU had to do is more or less do what they did to Texas, where they shut down the run game and then make the passing game beat you. But J.J. McCarthy threw for over 300 yards, and they still lost. I think what you're going to need to do is play that bend, don't break, confuse them with a 3-3-5. You know your defense is going to give up points, but you also know your defense is fast and aggressive enough, especially in generating turnovers, to where you're going to have to take advantage of that part of the game, because TCU had breaks go their way in the game with the fumble on the 1 yard line, with Michigan attempting to run a Philly special and things like that. They're going to need breaks like that. Just like with the Michigan game, they're probably going to need to jump out to an early lead and then hold on through the rest of the game, because Georgia has shown they're not just going to lie down and go away. What they can't do, or something that I was worried about TCU going into the Michigan game, what you cannot do is go down early, because Georgia will put this game away if that happens. And that is something that TCU has had trouble with. Despite the fact that TCU is one of the best second-half teams in the entire country, there are certain things that you can get away with against like a Baylor or a Kansas State that you just can't do with Georgia. But then again, I thought that would be the case against Michigan too. One point of concern with TCU is we do not yet know the status of running back Kendre Miller. As of Friday before the game, which is when I'm taping this video, it doesn't seem like he's going to play, but we don't entirely know for sure. He was the second leading rusher in the Big 12 this year, behind Bijan Robinson, and TCU's offense is really built from being balanced, and they really are going to need that. One thing I like with TCU is that they have a certain level of mental resiliency. It's hard to quantify, but we have just seen them in so many different kinds of game situations where they've had to come back from down big, where they've had to go into places like Texas at night, on the road, on a night where their offense gets shut down, and one of the worst defenses in the Big 12 had to step up and win the game, and they did. So they have mental fortitude, and is the moment going to be too big for them? So I've spent a lot of time talking about David. Let's talk about Goliath. So Georgia is aiming to do something that doesn't happen too often in college football, and that is being a repeat champion. For as great and as consistent as Nick Saban at Alabama has been, he's only done it once, 2011 and 2012. That was the most recent time we have had a back-to-back champion. It's happened 2 other times beyond that in the last 30 years. The first time being Nebraska in the mid-90s, and then the second time was USC in the mid-2000s with 2003 and 2004. Quick aside, 2003 was actually a split title with LSU, so I don't really want to hear arguments about that. I know it still counts. It's a fairly rare and fairly difficult thing to do that happens maybe once a decade tops. And so this is very, very, very elite company, because people are talking about Georgia as if they're the new Alabama dynasty, and this game would certainly cement that status. So turnovers is probably one of Georgia's 2 big weak points coming into this game. They were -1 going into the first playoff game. They threw an interception. Now they're -2. TCU sits at +9. So if there is one advantage TCU has on defense, it's that they are very fast and aggressively hunt the ball. And so they're going to be putting pressure on Stetson Bennett and company to essentially generate turnovers and create more opportunities for themselves. And so that's one of the two big advantages I think TCU has over Georgia. The other being TCU's downfield passing game. Look, Georgia's given up almost 900 yards through the air in their last 3 games. I don't expect this game to be that drastically different in that stat point, just because Georgia has suffered some injuries both in their secondary and in their front 7. Yes, Jalen Carter's a monster. Yes, Yes, Ringo's a monster, but there's just, in this day and age with college football, they're going to get points. Another aspect for Georgia here is Stetson Bennett, who threw for almost 200 yards in the fourth quarter alone in the Peach Bowl. Can he step up and do it one more time? History suggests yes, his stats have gotten way better in the biggest moments in the biggest games. And even though he's not like a top NFL prospect, he seems to be the perfect quarterback for what Georgia needs. Like, my big question with TCU's defense is that do they have anybody that can even remotely cover Brock Bowers? Because that is going to be a nightmare matchup and has been all year for everybody. So between Georgia's balance on offense and just their stoutness on defense, so do we get the dynastic immortality, or do we get the Cinderella story here? And so Georgia, I can see a situation with this game where Georgia jumps out to like a 10 to 14 point lead early and just kind of, the game just kind of lingers at that point. So it wouldn't shock me if the game ended with a margin somewhere close to like 42 to 30, 42 to 34, something like that. But I just think that TCU is going to be hanging around for the entirety of this game. Win or lose, I just don't see a cover here for Georgia. So my official pick for the national title game, I'm kind of going to echo what I said in the Ohio State game. There is certainly a path here for TCU to win. I don't think this game is going to be the blowout people kind of are claiming in the way that Vegas is claiming. I just have a hard time believing that TCU would just go away because that hasn't been their thing all year. They very may well and probably will lose this game. I really do think they're just going to be hanging around the entire game because that's just been who they are all year. Now, the thing with Georgia is who they've been all year is they have just been dominant. They have been consistent. They have been disciplined. Turnovers aside, it's really, really, really hard to pick against a team with the consistency, with the talent, and with the experience that Georgia has. So, my official prediction for the national title game is that Georgia will win, but TCU will cover, and it will be one heck of a game. That's all I have for you guys today. Thanks for watching today, and thanks for watching all season. And now that the NFL season has wrapped up for the Commanders, there's plenty of questions going into the offseason, so stay tuned with the latest in the coverage on the team with the John Keim Report on Empire Media on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the games and have a good offseason.